Evening, everybody, and thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us for this evening's webinar hosted by AHDB for Beef and Lamb. I'm Katie Thorley, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Manager for Beef and Lamb within AHDB, and I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on Farmax and how the programme can help you benefit your system in making confident decisions to improve profitability. Our presenter this evening is Jack Keeys, who is Business Development Manager at Farmax. The plan of action this evening is Jack will take you through a presentation, and then there'll be time for questions and comments at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but I am going to probably run this slightly differently to a normal webinar, and that if you have any questions or you need any points of clarification as we go through any of the slides, write it in the question box on your right hand side of your screen, and I will interrupt Jack. Hopefully he won't mind that, and I'll ask him to clarify at that point in time, because I think that will probably make it a bit clearer for how to explain the programme. Hopefully there won't be any technical issues, but if there is, just please bear with us. So without further delay, I will hand you over to Jack for this evening's webinar.
Excellent. Thank you for the introduction, Katie, and again, good evening, everyone. As Katie said, please do feel welcome to fire through any questions, and Katie will read those out to me as we go through, or you're also welcome to save them for the end. But as Katie said, I'm Jack Keeys, a Business Development Manager at Farmax, and one of my primary roles at Farmax is looking after the UK market. And what that's meant in 2018 was I popped over for a couple of trips last year, and during my time I was actually just tallying up, and I think I've visited about 50 farms while I've been over in the UK, and probably a couple of you listening I've had the pleasure of meeting as well during my journeying over. And we've now set ourselves up so that there's a full Farmax UK version available farms right throughout the UK and Ireland. We've been setting up a strategic partnership network with key different tech companies and other organisations in the market, and also looking at new technology partnerships with some early startups as well. The idea being that for those getting on board with Farmax, especially in the early stages in the market, there's going to be a lot of pretty early collaborative opportunities, so that when you're picking up these tools, hopefully you're not having to use 5 or 6 different ones, but they're all already talking to each other by the time you're getting set up. So in 2019, there's obviously a lot of new tech developments coming across to the UK. We've got the upcoming B word, which I've been told many times I'm not allowed to mention, and obviously the constantly changing markets and climate that you're faced with. But at the same time, there is all of these opportunities coming up, and so I think it's a good excuse to set your New Year's resolutions to start managing your farm business with tools like Farmax, and seeing if we can start realizing some of that massive potential which is sitting in a lot of the UK farms. So we'll jump straight into the webinar content for today. You would have all been sent through the Shetland Showcase a couple of days ago, the case study, and may have had a chance to read through that. But the farms we'll be working through today on Farmax, other farm files, the live monitoring files of those farmers. And we'll briefly cover off 4 different sort of aspects of Farmax. We'll be going through the information that's required to set up a farm. We'll be looking at some of the reporting information that you get out for farm analysis. We'll be looking at monitoring in Farmax and what that means and what that involves, and then also scenario analysis. So for those familiar with Farmax, and there's a couple of you there, it'll be a bit of a short, sharp refresher. And those who have never seen Farmax before and don't have a clue what it is, it probably will be going through it a bit fast. So you definitely don't have to memorize every single thing that we're going through. This webinar is just to give you a bit of an overall refresher of all the, or an overall overview of all the different parts of Farmax. And we'll be able to get into more detail with questions or follow up after the webinar as well. So first off this evening, I wanted to look at Bigton, which is one of the monitor farms, or the monitor farm on Shetland. And this screen that we're looking at here is the Farmax main screen. And Farmax works in a sort of top to down, left to right fashion, just the same as if you're reading through a book. So on the left here, we've got Bigton Monitoring Farm. And by clicking these plus signs, we can see more about the farm. So I'm going to open it right up. When I've selected the top file level here, I can see the overall properties of Bigton Farm. We can see where it is, what calendar year it's in, and so on. And Bigton, the Farmax farm, has got 145 hectares in it. When I've selected this level, we can also see all of the background databases, which we might take a look at a little bit later on, and also all of the overall reports for this farm, which we will also look at later. But as we move down this tree view, the next sections that we see here is the blocks of the farm. So in Farmax, we want to set up farm systems with individual blocks that may have different growth rates. So that could be anything from a hill to a flat area, or improved pastures versus unimproved. And for Bigton, we've split it up into a 70 hectare block St. Ninian's Isle and a 75 hectare main block. So before I move on, I'm just going to look at some of the information we want to enter when we're looking at blocks in Farmax. Firstly is growth rate. And so we do have a growth rate library in the software, which allows you to select average or UK average pasture growth for a season. And that's if you haven't measured pasture before, or you're not too sure what your farm's capable of in terms of its annual growth rate. The library, if I click on it here, will give you some starting points of some different curves to use, which you can then refine. In this growth rate screen, to make changes, what we do is click into an individual cell and then just enter a number. So we can see, for example, we've got 0 growth in January, and then 5 kilos of dry matter, and this is per hectare per day in February. And if we said that actually next month is going to have a little bit more growth than that, we could enter a 7 and the growth rate will increase. In Farmax, you can also increase the growth rate in 10-day periods. So you might say that the middle and end of March is going to grow a little bit better. And then finally, if you're looking at setting up a farm and you have an overall growth profile like this one here, but you've got an indication, or you know from the neighbour next door, that your farm's probably capable of, let's say, 7 tonne, you can also enter an overall growth rate, and it will scale up your whole curve to give you total pasture growth. And this is important because Farmax is a pasture-based model. So by getting the most accurate data we can for growth rate, even if we're making a few assumptions in the first time we're setting up a farm, it's going to inform the feed supply part of the feed budget. And so we have a growth rate for every individual block which is in a farm. So St. Ninian's and main block each have their own growth profile. The other bits of information that we're after for a block, one of them is crops. And so we've got no crops on St. Ninian's Isle here, but we do on the main block. And so we can see here that we've got some forage rape, some barley grain, some straw, and some silage. So the type of information we're wanting to enter here is the area of a crop, when that crop is sown and when it goes back into pasture, and also the expected yield of the crop. Some of this other information, utilisation, dry matter, and costs, can also be edited, but all of these are also going to be populated with UK defaults if you're not too sure yourself. When you're entering crops, we've got a big list of options of, again, defaults for the UK, but you can also add and create your own. So you would select from this list and then edit the details based on the area and date that you're doing the crop. And the last bit of information that we put into a block is any nitrogen applications. And so the screen is versatile in that you can move nitrogen applications around on the screen as I've just done there. But generally, when we're entering a nitrogen application, we select new nitrogen and it will pop up on the screen. And again, just like the crop, we're entering in a rate or a response or a duration if we want to edit any of those. And most importantly, perhaps, is the area, what area we're going to apply nitrogen on. And so when we're looking at applying nitrogen, it's essentially contributing kilos of dry matter directly into the feed budget per kilo of nitrogen that's applied. So again, all nitrogen cropping and growth rate is important for building up that feed supply side of the feed budget. So that's the information required for setting up the land information when you're creating a new farm. And now we'll pop over to the animals. We can see on Bigton and on their 145 hectares, we've got some sheep, some beef, and what's actually pretty unique to this farm is some horses, which we've actually cheated and just made some heavy cows, I think, in this case. But what I'll do, just to go through again the input information for now, we'll look at one sheep mob, so we'll look at the ewes. For each different age group or species that you've got on your farm, we first want to know the number that you have at the start of the season and their average weight. And then we'd work through the rest of these screens under the data input heading here. So the first one here is numbers, and the numbers screen is essentially a stock rec for the season. Here we're starting off with 228 mixed age ewes at the start of the year, and we can see we've got a number of different headings, and under each heading for each month of the year you can enter transactions. So for example, in May 19 we've got a forecasted death of 3 ewes. In March 19 we've got a forecasted sale of 17 ewes. And in February we've got a transfer in of 100, which is where the gimmers that were born back in 17 are joining the mixed age mob. So when we're entering events in Farmax and setting up a plan or setting up a new file at the start of the season, to create an event, we'll go through a purchase example. We click new event or new buy. We can edit the date, and then we can pop in the number. So now we've purchased 10 ewes. You can also adjust the financials and the weights, or you can again use the defaults. The next bit of information we want for a mob, if they're a breeding mob, is the mating details. And so we can see here that this mob was mated 5th of December. Farmax again is going to populate all the default information for a breeding. So we've got default pregnancy percentages, lambing percentages, and weaning percentages. But you can then also enter your own override figures if you know that they're going to be slightly different than what's in the model. And after an event occurs, you can also record that as an actual historic event as opposed to just an adjusted forecast. This is all important because it's going to allow the model to know how many lambs are being born, how many lambs are there as part of the feed budget and available as replacement stock or stock to be sold, and also gives a weight to the lambs so that Farmax can calculate their demand for the feed budget. We've also got sharing screen, which I don't need to spend much time on, as we just click new share and an event will pop up, and again we can edit these details, so sharing dates and numbers, and if we want to, kilos and prices. There's a housing screen, which allows us to put animals into the shed over winter, or that might be for the winter or for lambing. And the housing screen at the moment, we can see these ewes are actually on pasture for the whole season. But if we wanted to put them into housing, we can click on new and then move in. And if we decided to move them in for the month of December, we just select the month and then select all. And now those sheep are in the shed for December, which will take their feed demand off of the pasture feed budget. The last screen that we'll look at is the performance screen. And there's quite a lot going on the screen in comparison to a couple of the previous screens. So we'll go through it line by line. At the start, we're going to look at this top section of the screen. This is where we can enter the feeding. So we're still looking at our ewes, and we can see here that we've got intakes of pasture, sheep nuts, barley grain, and silage. And that feeding is entered as kilos of dry matter per head per day. So Farmax is calculating how much pasture is required for these ewes based on their size and based on their weight and weight gain. And if we enter supplementary feeding, Farmax will then back calculate the rest of the pasture required. So for example, we've calculated in July there's going to be 3.3 kilos of pasture required. If I add in half a kilo of sheep nuts, Farmax will update and say, well, now we only need 2.7 kilos of pasture. And that's how Farmax is calculating pasture demand. We move down to the middle segment of the screen. This is the live weights. And here, this is where we'd enter body weight gain as grams per day or hit specific targets. So for example, if we want our ewes to be above 60 kilos in November, we can click and drag on this curve here, lift it up, and it will adjust their weight. That's probably getting a bit fat now, so we'll drop that down a little bit. Or we can enter body weight gain per day targets, which is especially relevant when we're looking at fattening mixed lambs or something like that. But we can also enter it for the ewes if we're wanting them to put on a little bit of condition or maintain their weight. And Farmax will calculate their weight gain going forward. The bottom of the screen is showing us the pasture cover. So this is actually just visible so that you can observe changes to your pasture forecast while you're making changes, but it doesn't actually, you wouldn't enter changes here in this screen, so we'll come back to that. The event screen over here, the final one on the list, is just an overview of everything else that's been entered. So we can have a quick scan through here and see when animals are mated, sold, lambing, weaning, and so on, and make sure that we haven't missed anything out. And with that, that's all of the inputs that we need in Farmax. And the good thing about that is we can now move on to why you want to put those inputs in and what sort of information you start getting out. Now, the first thing that we look at in Farmax, especially now we've got a bit of context for this farm, is the pasture cover report. So this is really important because it's essentially your live running feed budget of the farm, in that this green line here is the forecasted pasture cover for this farm. So we're talking kilos of dry matter per hectare available. And this grey line down the bottom is the minimum cover that the farm requires in order to meet animal demand based on the weight gain and the number of stock we've got on farm. So what would happen if we double the sheep numbers? This grey line is going to shoot up because there's bigger animal demand, and the green line will pop down because there'll be less pasture available. And what we want to happen is there to be a space between the green line and grey line, because that shows us that there's enough feed on farm to meet our targets. But we also want to be careful that the gap isn't necessarily getting too big, because that can result in inefficiencies or in potentially poor pasture quality creeping in. And if we look towards the middle of the season here, we can see pasture covers are increasing for a few months and getting above 3,000 cover at the moment on this farm. And this, though we're looking at Bigton's live farm, we're not looking at their completed 2019 plan, but this is just an example so that we can use it to look at some of the reports. So now we can see that the farm is feasible, but potentially has some opportunity to improve. We can look at where that opportunity is to improve and what the reports are telling us about it. So we're going to jump into some of these reports now. As you can see, there's a big list of them, and so I'm certainly not going to go through every one, but I'll go through 4 or 5 key ones. There's obviously an opportunity for any of you to check out the rest of the reports or ask questions about them. The first one we'll look at is the supply demand report. So this report, in the green, we can see the feed supply that the farm has got, which is primarily driven by that pasture growth rate. And we can also see feed demand in red, which is the animals' feed demand. So it's quite clear here that there's a very large feed surplus over the first 4 of the first 5 months of the season. And that's what's driving this rapid increase in pasture cover. So again, we can see here a feed surplus and then a little feed deficit here and at the end of the season, which could potentially be filled up. So this is already giving us clues about the farm system and where we could make improvements. But we can also look at a few other reports to dig even deeper. This report here is the pasture growth report, and it shows us the potential pasture growth of the farm in our light green. So that's this around the edge. And then the actual or the net pasture growth in the dark green dotted line. So what the farm's expected to actually grow. And this is often the most telling report, and one that I bring up with almost every farm we model in the UK, because it's usually showing that there's quite a lot of potential growth that's not being realised. So just to review this one again, the potential growth up here, this is what the farm could grow if pasture was managed perfectly, but the dark green line is what's actually growing. So this light green area never actually exists, and the dark green line is what will occur. So all the rest is just lost potential. And with all of these reports, if we have a look at the table tab, it will actually show us the numbers behind some of this, especially for those of you number crunchers. Key one to look at here. Again, I've made this a bit of an extreme example, but we can see the potential growth on this farm is 6,700 kilos or 6,800 kilos. But we've got loss of potential and we've got some decay. So the net growth that this farm's realizing is almost half of its potential. And that's where we'd look at where can we redesign the system so that we can make use of this potential and get a better fit for supply demand. And at the end of the day, the reason we want to do that is both to maximize our efficiency with the land we've got, but also to be as profitable as possible. And so though we haven't talked about it much yet, Farmax also has a full financial budget. And again, these are just industry average numbers applied on a bit of a random scenario. But we can see in the profit and loss statement, we've got every different income and expenditure item broken down here, and we can also see a bottom line profit. So if I now look at opportunities in this farm system, for example, potentially buying in some lambs to fatten up and sell, we could then look at what happens to the supply demand, what happens to the profit and loss, and so on. Another couple of reports that I'll quickly look at. One is Pasture Quality, again tied into pasture growth and supply demand. It's highlighting where some of that loss of potential is occurring. So this report's showing us green material, dead material, and stem within the pasture. So the model behind is calculating this based on pasture management and demonstrating that of this grass, a large proportion is turning to poor quality, and that poor quality has a lower ME. So our ME values are dropping down, and the stock are having to eat basically more mouthfuls of lower energy feed in order to meet their feed demands. Couple of other reports. Intake report gives us an idea of how much of feed intake is made out of pasture or forage and feed, and if we had a deficit, it would also occur here, or we'd be able to see it visibly here. And a final nice report to look at as a summary is the RMPP KPIs. This has been developed by an industry group in New Zealand, and they've picked some of the primary KPIs which they think are really driving profitability in New Zealand, and they can actually all be calculated in Farmax. So we've created a report which displays all of those, and I won't go through each of these individually, but again, this is, as soon as we've built a farm, we can measure all of the KPIs. You can see how these KPIs are calculated by clicking on them, and that allows for benchmarking between farms, or getting a good idea of where you could potentially look at some improvement. So that's all I wanted to cover off with Bigton Farm, looking at information that can be entered into Farmax, what information you need to set up a farm, and what else you can add to increase accuracy, and then also some of the reports you can start looking at. Next, I wanted to move on to Scotland, which is another farm on Shetland, and look at monitoring and then scenario analysis. If you do have any questions as we're moving on, feel free to send them through to Katie. So for Scotland, we can see here that there's a lot more blocks than the last Farmax file. Here we've got 7 different blocks, and this is where the farmer, Jamie Leslie, is setting up a lot of different growth curves and actually measuring pasture across most, if not all of these, so that he can get individual growth profiles for each of them. And they're ranging everywhere from 2,000 kilos to some of his rougher winter grazing, up to, I think the peak is around 7 to 8 tonne. So each of these has a different growth curve. And to give you a bit of an idea, Jamie's also running sheep and beef on his farm. There's a few more mobs in here because we can see where Jamie's separated some of his stock so that he can have some mixed lambs which run on rape, or for different feeding types. And another difference that we'll look at when we look at Jamie's farm is now that I've clicked on the pasture cover screen, we've got all of these blue dots on it. So looking at talking about Farmax monitoring, Jamie's been measuring his pasture covers since July 18. We can see he's entered a number of different pasture cover measurements once or twice a month. And this is a key part of monitoring in Farmax and looking at tracking your farm's performance. So what this means is Jamie's going out with a plate meter, walking around most of his farm, and generally we recommend at least 40% or about 40%, or at least 40% in terms of being able to get a relevant or respective farm average cover, and is then entering that into Farmax. This pasture cover curve that we've got is then able to be calibrated to what's actually happening on farm, and every time Jamie enters in a new pasture cover measurement, Farmax is going to reforecast what's happening in the future. In a moment, we'll look at a scenario of why that's relevant and how that can be important for decision making. But the other benefit of entering in monthly or fortnightly pasture cover measurements is that we can back calculate pasture growth rate. So at the start, when we were looking at Bigton and looking at the pasture growth rate, I showed you the pasture growth library and where we can use some average curves to start getting a feel for how much pasture your farm might grow, and then we can tweak it based on intuition or any measurements you have made. But where we've got farms completing their pasture walks and entering those into Farmax, their exact pasture growth rate is then being back calculated so that they can then use that growth curve and apply that to future scenarios. So at the end of the first 12 months, in about 6 months' time, Jamie's going to have full season's worth of pasture growth rates for his farm, which he's going to be able to apply to future decision making. And at the end of the day, pasture is the primary input of your farm model, and it's the basis of the farm system and the farm business. So properly understanding what you can grow or how much you are growing is a really important part of being able to manage that business as efficiently as possible. Pasture cover is the main input that we're looking at tracking, but another input that you can enter when we're looking at monthly tracking with Farmax is live weight events. So we can click in the event screen here and click new weighing, and whenever any animals are weighed, we can enter in the date that they're weighed and then a weight for them, and we can then calibrate the model to that. So that means that if I now click back in again, Jamie's ewes and this performance screen, a yellow dot has popped up where we've weighed those ewes, and we've then calibrated the model so that the model is making the animals weigh that amount, and it's back calculated the growth required to hit that target. And the advantage of that is that we now have a really accurate representation of the farm's demand based on the live weights of the animals. I'll just take that one back out. Now, moving on from there, if we look at tracking the file hypothetically in 2019, we can see Jamie's projected pasture cover measurement and the minimum cover, which we spoke about before, that animal demand line. What we're going to do is pretend that we've got all the way through to, let's say, April. We forgot to enter a few pasture cover measurements, but coming into April, we're going to say that grass is getting really tight. So we did a pasture walk and it came in, or we're going to have to push it even further. Sorry, Jamie, I hope this doesn't actually happen. 1150 cover. So done a pasture walk on the 10th of April and it's come in at 1150 kilos of dry matter per hectare. As I mentioned, when we put in a pasture cover measurement, Farmax not only is going to back calculate growth rate and say, well, you mustn't have grown anything at all in March, but it's also going to reforecast the future. And we can see now that in about 40 days time, right the way through in sort of middle of May, we've got a red dot here, or a red part segment of the line where there's an intersect between pasture cover and minimum cover. And that's telling us that in this farm system, there then is not enough feed to meet our targets, and we need to do something about it. So what we'll do here is I'm going to use this as a basis for running a scenario and looking at how we can improve the model. So firstly, I'm just going to close out of Bigton now, but we can open it again at the end if there's any questions. And what we'll actually do is run through a full scenario with Scotland. So what we want to do to start off with is we're going to save the model as it is. And then we're going to close out of it. And this is going to show us a new window in Farmax, which is the Farmax main screen and where we start off. So a good excuse to tell you a little bit about how this works. As you can see on the left-hand side, I have a whole heap of farm names on this list, which are a combination of hypothetical Farmax training farms and a few of our clients' farms. And on the middle of the screen, because I've selected Scotland here, we can see all of the different Farmax files for this farm. For this farm, we've got a monitoring file, which is the one that we're updating. We've also got a 2017 season, a 2018 season, a 2019 season, and some old scenarios where Jamie and I have been creating different options for the farm system. So in this cloud window, I can right click on this file that we've just been working on, which is this one here, and duplicate it. And we're going to call this monitoring scenario. And I'm going to use the control button and click on both of these farms so that we can open them both up at the same time. Now this is opening up. I've got two files open and they're both identical copies. I've got the one that we were just working on and then the new copy I've called scenario. So we look at pasture covers. We can see we've still got that same scenario where we've entered a pasture cover of 1150 and we've got an infeasible section. So now we want to revise the feed budget and see if we can fix this feed deficit. So what we'd do in this situation, for now, let's look at our beef because we haven't looked at cattle yet, and we'll click on our cows. The feed budget is going infeasible in March, so we're going to, and we've already entered the cover measurement for almost mid-April, so our options are slightly limited. So what we're going to do is say we have got quite a bit of straw and silage on hand. So in March, we're going to feed 5 kilos of silage to our cows. And as you can see, that's now made our budget feasible. It's given us just enough pasture to pull through and taken the pasture demand off from those cows in May, so that we can still meet our targets for all the animals on the farm. If we wanted to give ourselves a little bit more safety, we might feed a bit of straw as well, or we might look at feeding some silage to some other stock. Other options include buying in other supplementary feeds, selling off animals earlier, keeping animals in housing for longer and feeding them. We can look at all those types of different scenarios to fill a feed deficit and make sure that we're not going to get to middle of March and suddenly not have enough feed and that end up impacting our animals' performance. So that's one example of a scenario and running a scenario while we're monitoring. But another thing that we can do is looking at, rather than fixing a deficit, is filling an opportunity. And so we can see here through August, September, October, and so on, that there's potentially a bit of feed surplus available. So what we're going to do this time is pop out our pasture cover screen, and to do that we click the little arrow in the top left corner, and then we can look at this report as we're going through Farmax. I'm just resizing that. We're also going to, for now, pop out the supply demand report so we can see where those surpluses are occurring on this farm. We can see a big surplus in April, May, and then again August, September. And we're going to see what we can do to make the most of this opportunity. So for this scenario, because again we're already in April, I'm going to look at filling potentially some of the feed surplus towards the end of the season. And as a quick and easy scenario, I'm going to pretend that we can get a hold of some lambs, and we're going to bring on some mixed lambs to fatten. So I right click up here and add a new enterprise, and we've got sheep 2. And now I'm going to add a new mob as some mixed lambs. Now we've got a new animal group on the farm. If we go to numbers, we can adjust the age, we can adjust the weight and so on, but because I just want to run a quick scenario, we're going to be buying in these lambs a bit old, but what we'll do here is enter a purchase in the middle of August. So I'll just move these screens over while I enter these events. We're going to buy, middle of August, 250 lambs. So now our feed, our pasture cover has now dropped off for August. And actually it looks like we haven't had a massive impact. So because we're looking at the pasture cover screen and the supply demand screen as we're doing this, we can see, well, actually, potentially we can push that all the way up to 500. Still hasn't had a big impact. This is quite a large farm, so we'll leave it at 500. And before this feed deficit starts creeping in, we'll sell off these lambs again the end of September, so about 60 or 50 odd days later. So I've entered new sale, I'm selling all. And again, now pasture cover's jumped back up at the end of the season, but we have got it a little bit more under control through August, September. One other thing we want to do is make sure that these lambs are putting on weight. At the moment, they're only putting on 20 and then 18 grams a day. So let's look at August and September's pasture covers, 2579 and 2428. But bump up these weight gains to at least 150 grams. And again, pasture cover is now decreasing because these lambs are eating more feed to make the weight gains. And our surplus, though it hasn't made a massive impact, has started to decrease a bit. So that's how we can run a scenario in Farmax. I'll close out of those extra screens now. But remember, we've still got our original monitoring farm open. So we can click on the all farms level here. And at this level, when we have more than one farm open, we can select different reports and look at comparing our two scenarios. The first one I'll look at is pasture cover. We'll just look at the 2019 year. And as you can see, the first file in the red, we've got more pasture than in the second file in the green, which is our scenario. And that's where those mixed lambs have come on and started to control our pasture a little bit better. But the other one that you usually want to look at when looking at a scenario is our profit and loss. We can see what impact does it have on the bottom line in terms of financials, and are these decisions profitable to be making. We can see that we've got a few added costs that have come in with our scenario, and a little bit of profit. Looks like we probably bought the lambs for close to what we sold them for, so not much of a financial difference, but we did control the grass a bit better and almost make another grand. So sorry, Jamie, we didn't add too much to your bottom line, but it's something. And essentially that's how we run a scenario, and we can then go back and looking at other changes or other options. We could adjust these live weights, make the ages a little bit more relevant, and see where we could make use of some of these other surpluses or deficits. So with that, we've now gone through the information required to set up a Farmax farm. We've gone through some of the reports, looking at monitoring information and just one example of where we can use monitoring information to help facilitate decision making, and then finally running a quick scenario and looking at comparisons. So thank you very much for listening. That's most of the content I wanted to go through with you all today. So if we've got any questions, we're more than happy to answer them. But also we'll be sending out an email at the end, and you'll be more than welcome to set up a session to go through potentially setting up your own farm.
Okay, thank you very much, Jack. If you've got any questions for Jack, obviously, if you write those in the questions box, I will read those out to him in a second. If you need to go through and recap on anything that we've gone through tonight, it has been recorded and will be available online in the next few days. You will get an email when that is available online. Right, we have a question. How does this differ to AgriNet, and what are the advantages and disadvantages between the two systems?
Yeah, really good question. So AgriNet and Farmax are actually working together at the moment in terms of we do see them as complementary products, so it can take you through some of the differences or similarities. In AgriNet, you'll be putting in, and I'm no expert in AgriNet, but I can give a brief overview. You'll still be putting in your pasture cover measurements as you would in Farmax. And AgriNet's going to give you more of a short-term feed wedge, sort of feed allocation type information, in that you'll be able to use it to describe or to identify where you might want to move stock in the immediate or short term, and how those movements might occur within the farm, and also get an idea of growth rate. But most of the information that you use AgriNet for is shorter term and more day-to-day management, whereas Farmax is more of a sort of full season tool, and it does bring in quite a little bit more information in terms of the full farm system. What we'll be looking at in 2019 is an integration between AgriNet and Farmax, and that will involve pasture covers being able to automatically import into Farmax from AgriNet, so that you can actually get the benefits of both, where you can use AgriNet for those sort of short-term stock management decisions, and then also have that information come into Farmax for your long-term strategic and technical decisions, and pulling in the financial budgeting as well.
Okay, thank you very much. How long do you think it will be to set up a file?
Another really good question, and unfortunately the answer is one of those cliche, it depends. But in general, if it's quite a simple system with only a few different stock classes and a couple of blocks, to completely set up a full system, it wouldn't take more than a couple of hours. But it can take anywhere up to 4 or 5 hours to completely fully set up a full farm file with all your information for the year. But that's looking at everything from adjusting crop energies and final yields. To set up the basis of a Farmax farm would probably only take an hour.
Okay, thank you. And how much do you think it would take up, how much time do you think it would take up per month for the producers?
Yeah, another good question. So it does change a little bit over time at the start when you're getting used to it. We actually do monthly sessions together. So we book in a time each month, and for probably the first 3 to 6 months at least, we do a half-an-hour phone call per month where we help you enter in your information, going through the screens, checking out what you might want to be looking at Farmax for in terms of tactical decisions as well. And then after those first few months, as you're getting the hang of it, you don't need to do the sessions anymore, though you're more than welcome to continue, but would still expect it would be about half an hour a month. But in those busier periods where there's lots of mating events and sales happening, might take up to an hour or more, where you've got a few things to enter. And then the quieter months where you're just putting in a pasture cover measurement or a little bit of feeding, it might only be 20 minutes.
Okay, and who can help them understand the reports and what they actually mean for their business?
So there's a couple of different options there. Farmax is able to provide a lot of support, particularly in terms of setting up your Farmax files and taking a look at reports at face value. Then we've also got a network of consultants in the UK, which is building, and a lot of those consultants are taking the Farmax accreditation, so they're certified to be able to use our product to best practice. And those consultants are also available to provide further support if you want sort of the more advisory level information on analysing reports. So it's a combination of using Farmax to initially get a good understanding and perhaps for your own decision making. And if you want to look at engaging a consultant, we can also make referrals as well. And that's names such as Poppy Freighter in Scotland, James Daniel, Matt Blythe, quite a few different consultants which are accredited or getting accredited in software.
Okay, brilliant. And do producers need a plate meter to be able to measure the pasture heights on their different fields?
No, don't need a plate meter. It does seem to be the preferred option to go for at the moment, but there's still a lot of people that are measuring the grass just with a sword stick. So using a compressed sword stick measurement like the AHDB sword stick. But we've also got Farmax sword sticks which we can send out. So the sword stick's more than enough to get you measuring your grass for your average farm covers for Farmax, but then you can look at moving on to the plate meter as well.
Okay, and I think this is the final question unless anyone else has got any more. So if you do have any more, please type them in the box. I will just have had another one come in actually. Do I need to weigh everything?
Another good question. You certainly don't need to weigh everything. Even if you weigh nothing, whenever you sell stock, you're obviously going to get information about their weight when they're sold under most sales transactions. So you can actually calibrate your Farmax model to sales weights. Let's say you sell your top 10% of lambs and they weigh 45 kilos. We can put that in, calibrate the model, and it will make your model more accurate. So even sales themselves are enough to calibrate a model. The more information you have, though, the better. So if you're weighing your stock a couple times a year, so we can get a better idea of the live weights, the model is going to be more accurate. But even if you're just using a guess and you're within a reasonable amount, it's still going to give you a pretty accurate depiction of how much feed those animals are going to need. So short answer is you don't need to weigh them, but if you do, it's better.
Okay, and so our final question this evening is, what are the next steps if I'm interested?
Good one. So if you're interested, there'll be an email sent out at the end of this webinar, which will tell you how you can sign up for a setup session to get started with Farmax. Or if you don't want to sign up for a full setup session yet and just want to ask more questions, you can just email me through or call through directly, and my contact details will be there. So if you get in touch, these first few sessions I'll be running myself, so I'll be helping do the farm setups for anyone who wants to give it a go.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Jack. I hope that has been useful. It's a great presentation discussion as to what the files do and how they can benefit the system. So thank you everybody for listening, and it will be emailed through and available on the YouTube channels, as are all the previous webinars if you need to revisit it. So thank you once again, and I hope you all have a lovely evening.